Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm Ukrainian Canadian. Today is March 28th, 2025, and let's get to the news and map updates happening in Ukraine and Russia, shall we? So we're going to go exclusively through the map, and then I just want to give you a small update on the latest minerals deal between the US and Ukraine and some new developments. So let's first talk about a good Ukrainian win in the village of Andriivka. And this was shared by Ukrainian soldiers about a day ago. They shared footage of the destruction of a large armored convoy, Russian armored convoy, consisting of T-72s and other infantry fighting vehicles, and Ukraine managed to destroy or damage 12 of them. Which leads me to the images that were shared. As you guys can see, in true Russian fashion, but to be fair, this is now the reality of war. Even the Ukrainians were doing the same, welding metal plates, a bunch of camouflage, anti-drone nets, and chain link in order to kind of avoid these FPV drones. But you can see that the Ukrainians still did a good job. It's been confirmed that they destroyed about 12 of these tanks and IFVs. And these armored vehicle attacks, whether it be tanks, IFVs, APCs, are becoming more and more rare for Russia. It's a clear sign of their military decay. I've already talked about it numerous times. Russia has to resort more and more in using civilian vehicles, scooters, even we have seen donkeys being used and horses to resupply forces in the front line. They're really decaying quickly. And I believe that the last time I personally reported on such a large scale armored attack was perhaps a month and a half, 2 months ago. Like, we just don't see these types of attacks anymore from the Russians throughout the front line. Last year, that was pretty consistent. Like, on a weekly basis, we would see somewhere, whether it be in Donetsk, in Kharkiv, in Zaporizhia, the Russians would be constantly using armored vehicle attacks somewhere. Not all the time, but perhaps once or twice a week, we would be seeing these massive armored vehicle assaults. Now, that is a rarity for the Russians. And of course, take it with a grain of salt. It's not definitive. That's my personal assessment, but it really feels like this is the final year where we're going to be able to see Russia conduct perhaps one last big offensive in the summer. And Ukraine is already hinting at that Russia's preparing itself for like a massive offensive in the summer, perhaps late summer, kind of a last Hail Mary to see if they can get something done and break through the Ukrainian lines. Because I can't, their armored vehicle fleet is just, it's going down, and they're not able to replenish their armored vehicles. That's why we've been seeing the Russians using more and more of these Soviet vans, civilian vehicles, scooters, motorcycles to bring forces to the front line and also supplies to the front line. And that's not efficient, and they're just completely unprotected. So to me, there's a clear sign of military decay, and it only gets worse for the Russians. That is not to say that Russia is done for. We've seen that they simply don't care about the lives of their soldiers, and for them it's easier to die than to live. And they still are a major threat. Even if there was a ceasefire, I'm under no impression, I'm not going to lie to myself in thinking that somehow that's it and Russia's never going to be able to do offensive again, either against Ukraine or the Baltics or other countries in Europe. Russia has shown time and time again that they're willing to die and willing to spend millions of people for their ambitions. So we cannot forget that. But some very good news, and Ukraine continues to successfully defend itself. And part of the thing I wanted to talk about as well, something I've been discussing over the last few weeks/months, over the last 2 months, we have a new, of course, commander of the land forces in eastern Ukraine, General Drapate, who has been helping in centralizing the Ukrainian military structure into a core structure, bringing a lot of Ukrainian brigades and battalions together so they can coordinate better. And we're seeing a lot of positives as well. Whereas in the past, Ukraine's strategy, especially around Avdiivka, was about, withdrawing. We saw first Russia took Avdiivka, then they started pushing around Berdeche, then they got all the way up to Vovche, Progress, all these small villages here, Ocheretine. And it felt like during the summer, there was this momentum for the Russians, and Ukraine's strategy in this direction was just constantly withdrawing while inflicting maximum casualties. But now we've seen a shift since Drapate came to power in this direction. Specifically, he's been able to start mounting counteroffensives, small ones, small counterattacks in around the peripheries of Pokrovsk, of Donetsk, and Ukraine has been able to destabilize the Russian offensive, where it felt like they just would be unstoppable. And yes, it would be crawling gains by the Russians, but they were still going forward. Now we're seeing that there's a lot of back and forth, and Ukraine is capable of also destabilizing the Russians. It's not perfect. We're still seeing, as you guys can see here, around the Donetsk area, the Russians gain a small foothold south of Donetsk. But additionally, we're seeing that the Ukrainians in certain other directions, like in the peripheries of Pokrovsk, they're putting a lot of pressure around this Russian position here around Peshchane and Uspenivka. They're trying to cut off the Russian forces that are present here, and that is working to a certain extent. So I'm seeing very good positives here. And another thing that indicates why Russia has been in dire need of armored vehicles, especially in this direction, is because they're using more and more artillery, because they can't rapidly react to the Ukrainian counterattacks with their own armored vehicles. So they have to use more artillery to kind of just try to shell Ukrainian positions. And Ukraine is easily then counterattacking by destroying these artillery systems. I think a few days ago, there was like a record day for Ukraine where they destroyed 100 artillery pieces of various sorts, but that was unheard of, kind of a new record for the Ukrainian forces. So we're seeing that the Russians are really decaying militarily speaking in this direction. In terms of other updates, there's some other positives and negatives. In the Kupiansk direction, you can see Ukraine also has been able to gain back certain lost positions around Kupiansk. You can see that north of Kupiansk, there's a lot of blue around the area of Sinkivka. This has been ongoing battles for the last 2 years. Russia's been pushing here, then Ukraine's been counterattacking. So this area has been very contested over the last few years, very hot. You can see here north of Zapadne, north of Kupiansk again, Ukraine's been able to regain some territory here, and some other small village that was retaken by the Ukrainians a few days ago. So that's the positive here, but you can see that for the negative, the Russians have been able to gain a little bit of ground here, more east of Kupiansk, northeast of Kupiansk around Peshchane, where they kind of gained some territory in this open field area. So again, there's a lot of back and forth, as I've been saying, but one positive thing about all of this, what we're seeing right now is, oh, and there's another update here. You can see how the Russians push slightly. There's like a thin territory that they gained around Katerinivka. This is the Ivanivka section. So that is around the Liman, Lysychansk area. So one thing I want to say is that although we're seeing, yes, the Russians are still gaining ground, they're still pushing in certain directions, that is not the only thing that is constant now. Ukraine is also able to counterattack, have some of their own gains. As you can see here, there's another small Ukraine gain around north of the Liman area. So there's a lot of back and forth, but Ukraine is also able to counterattack and answer back when necessary, and finding these Russian weaknesses as well. So it's not like it's all going just Russia's way in Ukraine right now. So that is the positive sign I'm seeing. And the general in charge of really coordinating the defense and also the offensive operations, General Drapate, he's not the one who should be taking the entire credit, but he's doing a great work centralizing the Ukrainian forces, coordinating attacks, having these open channels, and forcing other Ukraine commanders to give truthful, factual information rather than, making them lie just so they look good. So I'm seeing some good positive signs on that end. And with regards to the other region, so that is Belgorod and Kursk, no real changes. The only thing I can tell you guys is we've already talked about Belgorod, the small Ukrainian incursion in the past week, where Ukraine has been able to gain about 15 square kilometers of Russian territory around Demidovka. So this has been updated by Deep State. You guys are seeing that Ukraine controls about 15 square kilometers here. And we're just going to have to get used to that. A lot of border incursions by the Ukrainians. I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if this is going to be one of many in the future. And in Kursk, Ukraine still controls some territory, of course, much less than what they controlled back in August, perhaps around 50 to 80 square kilometers. But this is still territory that Ukraine still controls in Kursk, in Russia. And you can see that a lot of the battles have switched to kind of the border area. So that's the situation right now in kind of northern Ukraine area between Russia and Ukraine, the Sumy region. So that's the map update I wanted to give you guys with regards to the map changes. Now, let's go back to the news, because I also told you guys I wanted to give you some updates with the minerals deal, because we have some new updates here. And unfortunately, it's not positive, but it's not something that will surprise us knowing Trump. So there's a new kind of agreement, a new draft of an agreement that was proposed by the United States, by Trump himself. And it does not look good in terms of a beneficial deal for Ukraine. So according to this text of the March agreement, US companies would receive priority rights to all future investments in natural resources and infrastructure. Only if they refuse will Ukraine be able to offer participation to other investors, including European ones. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government is obliged to disclose all confidential details of such negotiations to the United States. That's just terrible. Essentially selling your soul to the US. In a separate clause of the agreement, it obliges Ukraine to add to its licenses for the extraction of critical minerals a ban on their sale to buyers from countries which the US Development Finance Corporation defines as strategic competitors of the United States. Also, selling your soul to the US by signing this agreement. However, the most controversial clause is the one that deprives Ukraine of control over the fund. This fund that will be established to repay the United States for all their help for Ukraine. And so it deprives Ukraine of control over the fund, which will be used to reimburse the US for the value of the assistance provided. And the clauses here is that the general partner of the fund who will manage its activities will be appointed by the DFC, so this US Development Finance Corporation, without the consent of Ukraine. The majority of the fund's board will consist of US representatives, and their votes will be sufficient to make decisions without the consent of Ukrainian representatives. And there's another one here, the fund, which will be financed by Ukrainian natural resources and infrastructure, will pay taxes in the US, not Ukraine. So even the taxes will go back to the United States rather than Ukraine. So again, what we're seeing here, guys, is classic Trump. He's aiming for the moon. And when it comes down to making a deal, and it's also a true exhibition, again, for those that might not know by this time, of the mafia boss values and governance in this administration by Trump. And what is Ukraine's strategy here? What should Ukraine do? In my opinion, Ukraine will have to continue delaying. Counter-offering is part of that delay strategy, saying, well, we agree on these points, but not on these points. Let's rewrite it. Let's see if we can do some changes, right? And try to remove as many of these predatory clauses as possible to buy time. Because unfortunately right now, that's what Ukraine has to do. Ukraine still needs to have that Biden assistance come through, because that's what Trump withdrew a few weeks ago, right? He withdrew that Biden assistance, the military aid, intelligence sharing to Ukraine a few weeks ago, because Ukraine didn't want to sign this deal. That's what he said. So Ukraine's going to have to buy time in order to continue receiving that help. Long term, again, we need to also realize that implementing this, even if Ukraine was to sign this under duress, it means absolutely nothing. First of all, Ukraine can always come back a few years later and say we signed this deal under duress, we were extorted by the US, and we don't have to abide by these agreements. We were pressured. And again, implementing this will take years and years, and this will outlive Trump himself, which I hope it will. But it is clear, if there's one thing that we can take out of this, predatory minerals deal being pushed by Trump himself and his administration, it's very clear to me that after the Biden assistance is fully delivered, probably by the end of this spring or summer, I don't know when exactly it's going to end, Trump won't give a single thing to Ukraine anymore. I rather expect the worst case scenario than the best case scenario, but it's very clear. Trump despises Zelensky. I thought to a certain extent that there was some logic behind what he was doing, that he could be guided in the right direction and figure out that helping Ukraine is the best thing for him, but he's not doing that. And he simply doesn't care about Ukraine. So we need to expect that the US in the next few months is going to completely withdraw its support for Ukraine. And as I've said, I wouldn't be surprised if also the US is going to be blaming Ukraine and Europe for the failure of these peace talks that are currently ongoing. And, for Trump, as I said, it's much easier to blame the weaker side than the supposed stronger side. And he respects Putin himself. He said that if I was Putin, I would have done the same thing. And he constantly regards Putin and respects him and admires him. So all these signs are clear that Don't expect any help from Trump and his administration from the United States over the next 3-4 years. I'm expecting that, and unfortunately, Ukraine is going to have to really rely on Europe and other partners, which are still not ready, unfortunately. But right now, what Ukraine needs to do is to buy time, delay this deal, and try to find ways to just continue just lengthening this process, so they can get all the help, maximize the help that Ukraine can get from the US. We don't have a choice, unfortunately, and kind of just maximize it. And when it's going to be clear that Trump is not going to be willing anymore to provide any assistance or help to Ukraine, then finally Ukraine can start working more with Europe and disregard the United States, because they're going to be irrelevant. They're not helpful anyways. And instead of being part of the solution, the US has become part of the problem, unfortunately. So that's the video for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed my update. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think about the several map changes and my comments on this minerals deal. It's predatory. It sucks that the US is doing this to Ukraine, but that's the reality and the truth behind the governance and the values of this Trump administration. They don't care about morality, about what's right. They're just going to behave like a mafia, unfortunately, rather than the just and ethical global sheriff that the US once was. So thank you so much, guys. Please, if you enjoy my content, subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave me a comment, and I will see you in the next one. Slava Ukraini!